The first thing Karen Parker noticed that morning was the black SUV parked across the street. It wasn't just the vehicle itself that set her off, it was the man who owned it. He had moved in barely a week ago, yet Karen already knew he was trouble. He didn't wave to neighbors, didn't attend the HOA welcome meeting, and, worst of all, he didn't follow the rules. And if there was one thing Karen couldn't tolerate, it was people who thought they were above the rules. For 15 years, she had dedicated herself to keeping Willow Ridge Estates in perfect order. Every lawn trimmed exactly to HOA standards, every mailbox at regulation height, every porch light warm-toned, never white or blue. She had personally written more violation notices than she could count, ensuring that their peaceful, upscale community stayed pristine and respectable. But now, this Ethan Carter had arrived, and Karen's carefully curated world was already starting to crack. She stood at her front window, peeking through the lace curtains, eyes locked on Ethan as he stepped casually out of his SUV. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the kind of calm confidence that immediately put her on edge. His dark sunglasses obscured his face, making him look even more suspicious, and he didn't acknowledge a single neighbor as he strode toward his house. No friendly nods, no polite waves, just a silent, unbothered presence that screamed outsider. Karen's fingers curled around the curtain fabric as she muttered under her breath. She knew his type. Lone wolves. Men who kept secrets. Men who thought they didn't have to answer to anyone. She had spent too many years making sure Willow Ridge Estates remained a safe and wholesome place to let some stranger ruin it now. Then, she saw it, the black duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The way he gripped the strap, the slight strain in his forearm as if the bag had significant weight. Karen's breath hitched. Drugs. Stolen money. A weapon. She had seen enough crime shows to know what that meant. A man like that, carrying something so heavy, so secretive, moving in the dead of night? He was hiding something. Her heart pounded as she yanked her phone off the counter, her fingers moving on instinct. She didn't even need to check the number, she had it memorized better than her own. As the line connected, she lowered her voice to an urgent whisper, even though she was in the safety of her own home. 911, what's your emergency? Karen's eyes remained glued to Ethan as he disappeared into his house, shutting the door behind him. This is Karen Parker from Willow Ridge Estates, she said, her voice tight with certainty. I need officers here immediately. There's a highly suspicious man in my neighborhood, possibly armed. I believe he's involved in criminal activity. Karen stood at the curb, arms crossed over her chest as she watched the last of the police cars roll out of Willow Ridge Estates. She had expected them to drag Ethan Carter out in handcuffs, to confirm her suspicions, to prove she had been right all along. Instead, they had spoken to him for barely a minute before getting back into their vehicles and leaving. No interrogation. No search. Just a few hushed words exchanged before they saluted him, and went on their way. Karen's stomach twisted as she stormed back inside, slamming the door behind her. FBI. That's what they had said. Special Agent Ethan Carter, working undercover. But she wasn't convinced. Anyone could buy a fake badge online. Anyone could claim to be law enforcement if they were smart enough to play the part. And Ethan? He was too smooth, too controlled, too good at hiding things. That wasn't the behavior of a man with nothing to hide. No, Karen was sure of it now, he was dangerous, and she was the only one willing to do something about it. She spent the next morning crafting a formal complaint to the HOA board, citing multiple infractions Ethan had allegedly committed since moving in. His SUV was unapproved, too darkly tinted, parked too close to the curb. His front porch light was too bright, not HOA regulation warm white. His grass wasn't edged properly, creating an uneven aesthetic next to his neighbor's meticulous lawns. One rule violation after another, all neatly typed up in Karen's signature passive-aggressive tone, ready to be enforced. She wasted no time. By noon, she had emailed the list to every HOA member, CCNG herself for good measure. By 2 p.m., she had the community landscaper skip Ethan's lawn entirely, let him see what it felt like to be an outsider. By 4 p.m., she had personally called the towing company, citing a neighborhood ordinance that technically didn't exist, demanding they remove Ethan's SUV on the basis that it was unsightly and oversized. By the time dusk settled over Willow Ridge Estates, Karen was seated comfortably on her front porch, iced tea in hand, as she watched Ethan step outside to find his vehicle missing. She savored the way his jaw tightened, the small shift in his stance as he pulled out his phone. She imagined the irritation in his voice as he called the towing company, only to be told he was in violation of HOA standards. But the real victory came later that evening, when she overheard Ethan's phone conversation through her open kitchen window. She wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, of course, but if he chose to stand outside on his porch making late-night calls, that was hardly her fault. "I know exactly who's behind this," his voice was calm, too calm. "No, I'm not going to retaliate. Let her think she's winning." A pause. A low chuckle. "Trust me. She's going to make this easy for me." Karen's fingers tightened around her glass. He was talking about her. But what did he mean? The next day, she took her efforts a step further. If the police wouldn't take action, if Ethan wouldn't be intimidated, then she needed to go higher up the chain. She spent her morning composing a meticulously worded, anonymous letter to the FBI headquarters, claiming that one of their agents was behaving erratically, violating community safety, possibly using his job as a cover for criminal activity. It was a perfectly constructed complaint, vague enough to avoid immediate dismissal, urgent enough to warrant an investigation. She printed it, sealed it in an unmarked envelope, and dropped it off at the post office personally. By the time she returned home, she felt a sense of triumph settling in her chest. If the HOA wouldn't get rid of Ethan, if the police wouldn't, then the FBI would have to. It was only a matter of time before they realized their mistake, before they came storming in, exposing Ethan for what he truly was. But what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Ethan Carter had already seen this coming. And he was waiting. Karen paced the length of her kitchen, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she checked her email for the third time that hour. There was no response from the FBI, no confirmation that her letter had been received, no indication that anyone was taking her concerns seriously. She had expected something, a follow-up call, an agent arriving to question her, at the very least some sign that Ethan Carter was finally under the scrutiny he deserved. But nothing. That was the problem with the system. People like Ethan slipped through the cracks. They knew how to manipulate authority, how to play the game just well enough to stay above suspicion. If Karen wanted to keep Willow Ridge Estate safe, she couldn't sit around waiting for some bureaucratic process to catch up. She needed proof, undeniable evidence that Ethan wasn't who he claimed to be. That night, she sat in the shadows of Frank Mitchell's front yard, crouched behind a row of neatly trimmed hedges, her binoculars locked on Ethan's house. Frank, beside her, shifted uncomfortably, his nerves already fraying under Karen's relentless determination. "This is getting out of hand," Frank muttered, watching as Ethan stepped onto his porch, phone pressed to his ear. "Maybe he's really just." Karen hissed for him to be quiet. Ethan's posture was too stiff, his voice too low, his words a murmur carried away by the wind. She couldn't make out what he was saying, but she was certain it was code. He was hiding something. And then, just as she was preparing to whisper another command to Frank, her eyes landed on it, a small Amazon package sitting on Ethan's doorstep. Karen's mind raced. What if it was evidence? What if it was filled with documents proving his deception? She didn't think, she acted. Before Frank could stop her, she darted across the street, snatched the package off Ethan's porch, and rushed back behind the bushes. "Jesus, Karen!" Frank gasped, eyes wide as he looked around. Are you out of your damn mind? That's stealing. Karen ignored him, her fingers trembling with anticipation as she tore open the cardboard. Inside, nestled among layers of protective foam, was a sleek black electronic device. It was small, featureless, something built for discretion. Her pulse spiked. A burner phone, she breathed. A tracking device. Something he's using for. The device suddenly lit up. A high-pitched beep echoed through the night. Frank dropped it like it was on fire. Oh my God. That's a tracker, isn't it? You just set it off. Before Karen could react, the sound of engines roared in the distance. Headlights cut through the darkness, the glow of multiple black SUVs reflecting off the manicured lawns of Willow Ridge Estates. Her stomach plummeted. Frank's voice was a broken whisper. We are so dead. The SUVs came to a screeching halt in front of Ethan's house, doors slamming open in unison. Tactical officers in dark uniforms poured out, moving with the kind of precision and speed that sent a cold sweat down Karen's spine. And then, stepping out last, his posture relaxed, coffee mug in hand, watching the chaos unfold with something between amusement and exasperation, Ethan Carter. Karen tried to compose herself, tried to stand tall as she had done in so many HOA meetings when dealing with unruly neighbors. This was just another confrontation. This is a misunderstanding, she announced, her voice only slightly strained. I was simply looking out for my community. One of the agents turned to Ethan, waiting for instruction. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee before finally setting it down. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something calm, dangerous. You stole a federal package, Ethan said, his voice level, almost bored. That's a felony. Karen felt a jolt of panic grip her chest. No, that's not, I was investigating. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his tone mocking, but sharp beneath the surface. Investigating national security? That's interesting, Karen, because what you actually did was trip a high-level federal tracking alert that was designed to notify us the moment it was tampered with. Frank let out a strangled noise. Oh God, we just got ourselves on some kind of list, didn't we? Karen clenched her fists. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to uncover the truth, not become the villain. But Ethan wasn't done. He took a step closer, his voice lowering just slightly. I'm going to let this go, he said, his tone measured, unreadable. But let me be very clear, if you interfere with a federal investigation again, Karen, there will be consequences. Real consequences. The officers stood down, returning to their SUVs as Ethan turned toward his house. He didn't look back at her as he stepped inside, the door closing with a finality that sent a chill through Karen's spine. Frank exhaled loudly. Well. That was worse than I expected. Karen barely heard him. Her mind was still racing, her heart pounding against her ribs. Ethan wasn't just brushing her off anymore. For the first time since this had begun, he had looked at her differently. Like she was a problem. And that meant she was getting close to something. She just didn't know what yet. Karen barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the scene over and over again, the black SUVs, the tactical officers, Ethan's cold stare as he warned her. He had dismissed her before, treated her like some meddling neighbor with too much time on her hands, but tonight had been different. Tonight, he saw her as a problem. And that meant she was closer than ever to the truth. She refused to back down. The HOA board had given her power, and she wasn't about to let some smooth-talking FBI agent make a mockery of her authority. If the law wouldn't stop him, she would. The next morning, she called an emergency HOA meeting, forcing the board members to gather in her pristine living room. A spreadsheet of Ethan's supposed infractions was projected onto her TV, highlighting every minor, fabricated, or exaggerated violation she had collected. He has to go, she declared, her voice firm, filled with manufactured urgency. I don't care what the police say, I don't care what kind of badge he flashes. He is a threat to this community. Some members exchanged wary glances, shifting in their seats. Even her most loyal supporters looked exhausted. Karen, one of them finally sighed, we've already had the police and the FBI here. Maybe we should just do nothing? Karen snapped, crossing her arms. You all saw what happened last night. Government agents storming our streets, disrupting our peace. And what do you think they were looking for? A criminal. And you're all just going to sit here and let him live among us? Frank Mitchell, visibly still shaken from the night before, hesitated before nodding. She's right. That wasn't normal. If this guy is really FBI, then why is he getting packages that make a whole SWAT team show up? Encouraged, Karen pressed forward. Exactly. That's why we have to push harder. The police won't help us. The FBI won't listen. But the HOA has power. If we organize a petition, if we force him out legally, he'll have no choice but to leave. And just like that, the vote started shifting in her favor. By noon, half the neighborhood had signed. By nightfall, Karen had mailed formal HOA complaints to Ethan's landlord, citing unauthorized activities, violations of safety regulations, and failure to comply with community standards. But it still wasn't enough. Because Ethan Carter was still there. Still standing on his front porch, sipping his coffee, watching her like she was some minor inconvenience he barely had time for. That's when she decided to go further. The next afternoon, she saw the perfect opportunity. Ethan wasn't alone. A young girl had arrived at his house, barely a teenager, her backpack slung over her shoulder. Karen watched as he welcomed her inside, his expression gentle, protective. Her eyes narrowed. Who was she? And then, just like that, the idea struck. She reached for her phone, hesitating for only a moment before dialing a number she had never called before. Child Protective Services, how can I help you? Karen adopted the most concerned tone she could manage. Yes, hi, she said, lowering her voice as if she were sharing something horrible. I don't want to cause trouble, but I live in Willow Ridge Estates, and I just noticed something deeply unsettling. There's a strange man in my neighborhood who has a young girl in his home, and I don't think she's safe. He's always coming and going at odd hours, and honestly, he's been under investigation before. I need to do the right thing. The woman on the other end of the line took her seriously. 2 hours later, a CPS caseworker and a police officer showed up at Ethan's door. Karen watched with glee as Ethan stepped outside, looking equal parts furious and stunned as they asked him for documentation proving his guardianship. The girl, his niece, Emily, stood behind him, confused, scared. The caseworker took her aside, speaking to her in hushed tones. Karen imagined Ethan's blood boiling as he was forced to explain, to justify his own family's presence in his own home. By the time CPS finally left, after an exhausting interview, Karen could see it, the pure, unfiltered rage in Ethan's eyes. For the first time, she felt something icy creep into her spine. This time, she had pushed too far. Ethan wasn't ignoring her anymore. This time, she had his full attention. Karen woke to the sound of sirens. For one glorious, fleeting second, she thought her efforts had finally paid off, that someone, somewhere, had finally listened to her warnings about Ethan Carter. She rushed to the window, her robe flapping behind her, already picturing the scene in her mind, Ethan being hauled away in handcuffs, neighbors gathering to whisper about how she had been right all along. But when she flung open the door, what she saw made her stomach drop. The police weren't at Ethan's house. They were in her driveway. 2 officers stood on her perfectly maintained lawn, their hands resting on their belts, their expressions unreadable. And standing just behind them, arms crossed, watching with the same infuriating calm as always. "Ethan." "Karen Parker," one of the officers asked, flipping open a notepad. Karen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "You are under arrest for trespassing, obstruction of justice, and theft of federal property. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Her entire world tilted. This wasn't happening. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was the one who enforced the rules, who held people accountable, who made sure Willow Ridge Estates stayed safe. This was wrong. As the officer gently took her by the wrists, she whipped her head toward Ethan, fury boiling in her veins. "You did this," she hissed. Ethan tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "No, Karen. You did this to yourself." The humiliation only deepened when she was released later that day, after a long and painful conversation with the authorities about overstepping boundaries. By the time she returned home, her entire reputation had crumbled. The neighborhood was waiting for her. Some people whispered. Others laughed. Someone had even placed a sign on their lawn, bold, mocking letters spelling out, "HOA Karen, enemy of national security." Ethan stood in his driveway, coffee in hand, watching the spectacle unfold. When Karen stormed toward him, her voice trembling with rage, he simply smiled. "Are you happy now?" she snapped. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee. "You mean now that I don't have to deal with you calling the cops on me every 2 days?" He shrugged. "Yeah. Pretty happy." Karen clenched her fists. "You may have won this round, but I'm watching you, Carter. And the second I find out." Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to send a chill down her spine. "Karen," he said, his tone calm, measured, dangerous. "You do not want to make me your hobby." For the first time since this started, real doubt crept into her mind. This wasn't over. It never would be. But as she turned and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this time, she had finally lost. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or a Karen, abusing their authority? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.